You've probably heard the term deconstruction floating around a lot lately. It's a word that's come to describe a really personal and often pretty painful journey for millions of people. So in this explainer, we're going to dig into the source material to figure out what's really driving this whole phenomenon, why it feels like such a crisis for so many, and what a path forward might actually look like. Okay, let's get into it. At the heart of so many of these stories, you find this simple but really painful formula. It goes like this. I was taught X, that's a set of beliefs, a way of looking at the world. Then I discovered Y, some piece of science or history or a really painful personal experience that just doesn't line up. And the result? Therefore, I can no longer trust Z, the institution, the leader, maybe even the entire system of faith. It's a story all about broken trust. And look, this isn't just a few people here and there. According to Pew Research, almost 22% of American adults were raised Christian but don't identify that way anymore. That's a huge number. It shows us that this whole deconstruction thing isn't some niche online trend. It's a massive cultural shift that represents millions of individual journeys away from the faith they grew up with. So what do we actually mean when we say deconstruction? Well, in this context, we're not talking about some high-level philosophy. We're talking about a personal process. It's about taking apart the faith you're handed, piece by piece, and really examining it to see what's there. Now, for some, this process leads them to leave faith behind completely. But for others, it's actually a step toward rebuilding that faith on their own terms. Okay, so why does this happen? Well, the source material we're looking at argues it's almost never just one thing. It's more like a perfect storm, a convergence of 4 different crises that are all connected. They just build on each other until the whole structure feels like it's about to collapse. First up, you have the intellectual crisis. This usually starts when someone asks a really tough question, maybe about science and faith or history or a part of the Bible that's just weird. But instead of a thoughtful answer, they get fear. They're told, you just have to have faith. And here's the key. When questions get treated like they're threats, the person asking eventually concludes that the truth being defended must be pretty weak if it can't handle a little scrutiny. Next is the moral crisis. And this is often the most painful trigger of all. It's sparked by seeing hypocrisy from leaders, or witnessing spiritual abuse, or watching a church choose to protect its own reputation instead of the vulnerable people it hurt. And that's not just a PR problem for the church. For the person seeing it, it becomes a deep, profound theological problem. Man, this feeling of betrayal is right at the center of the moral crisis. A quote from the source material just captures it perfectly. It's that moment when you realize the very people who demanded you believe their teachings without question aren't actually living by those same teachings. And that contradiction, it just becomes impossible to ignore. Then you have the relational crisis. You see, for so many people, faith isn't just a list of ideas. It's their entire world. It's family, friends, community. It's where they belong. So to start questioning your beliefs means you risk losing all of that. The fear of being pushed out or losing the people you're closest to makes the whole process of doubting incredibly lonely and painful. And finally, there's the narrative crisis. This is that moment of shock when you realize the Bible you were taught, the one with all the neat, tidy Sunday school stories, isn't really what the actual book is like. When you finally encounter the text in all its weirdness, its complexity, and its ancient context, it can honestly feel like you were lied to. It's just another layer of broken trust. So all of this, the intellectual, moral, relational, and narrative crises, it all builds to the central argument in our source material, and it suggests that we need to ask a really important question here. Are people really walking away from the core of the Christian faith, or are they walking away from something else entirely? And here's that question, plain and simple. Is this mass exodus from churches really a rejection of Jesus himself? Or is it a rejection of a distorted, culturally packaged version of Christianity that just couldn't stand up to reality? The source we're looking at argues that more often than not, it's the second one. And this slide really lays out what some of those distortions look like. For example, a lot of people are rejecting a God who seems to act like a political party's mascot, not the holy creator king the Bible talks about. They're walking away from salvation being pitched as just a get-out-of-hell-free card, instead of a life-changing allegiance to a risen Lord. And they're rejecting a church that's all about protecting its own power, not a community that's supposed to look like its self-sacrificing founder. Okay, so if the problem is a distorted view, then how do you fix it? Well, the source proposes a path toward what you might call reconstruction, and it starts by trying to recover the Bible's own mental world, basically trying to see the story through the eyes of the people who first wrote it. Now, this proposed framework has a kind of academic name, the Divine Council Worldview, But let's just strip away the jargon for a second. At its core, it's just about reading the Bible like the ancient book it is, one that sees the world as a populated spiritual place. In this view, there's a real cosmic conflict happening between God and rebellious spiritual beings, and the entire story of salvation is about God's grand plan to reclaim and restore all of creation from that rebellion. So here's the key claim. This ancient way of seeing the world isn't just some interesting but irrelevant piece of theology. The argument is that it directly addresses the very crises, the intellectual, moral, and narrative ones that cause people to deconstruct in the first place. So how exactly does this help? Well, for starters, it actually makes sense of all the weird supernatural stuff in the Bible, so those parts are no longer a huge shock. That, in turn, lets you see this much bigger, sweeping story of cosmic conflict, which is way more compelling than just a bunch of random rules. This worldview also gives you a more robust way to think about evil and suffering, because it acknowledges a real spiritual battle. And finally, all this shifts the goal of faith away from a fragile need for certainty and toward a resilient, trusting loyalty to God, even when you have unanswered questions. This slide really gets to the heart of the goal here. A brittle faith is like a Jenga tower. You pull out one piece and the whole thing comes crashing down. It's a faith where you think having zero doubts is the goal. But a resilient faith is completely different. It's strong enough to hold complexity, questions, and tension. It defines faith not as certainty, but as trusting loyalty. And crucially, it doesn't collapse under pressure. It actually gets stronger through challenges. And this is so important. The source is really clear that a new intellectual framework isn't enough on its own. The problem started with broken trust, right? So the solution has to involve a trustworthy community. As this quote puts it, people who are deconstructing aren't looking for a perfect church with all the answers. They're looking for an honest one, a place that can admit when it's wrong, that protects the vulnerable, and that actually makes space for the hard question. And that really brings us to our final thought. What if the entire goal of faith was never about building this perfect, unshakable fortress of certainty that just shatters the second it touches the real world? What if instead the goal is to cultivate a faith that's strong enough, flexible enough, and honest enough to actually survive reality, with all of its messiness, its beauty, and its complexity?